What are some of the biggest what-ifs in history? Story 1: Stanislav Petrov chose not to end the world. What if he hadn't? On September 26, 1983, a Soviet lieutenant colonel named Stanislav Petrov was on duty at a nuclear early warning facility near Moscow when the detection system reported an incoming American ICBM launch. Then it reported another. Then 3 more. 5 missiles inbound. The system was telling him with the highest confidence rating available. His protocol was unambiguous, reported up the chain as a genuine attack, which would have triggered Soviet launch on warning doctrine. Nuclear missiles fired before the incoming ones could destroy the silos they were sitting in. Petrov didn't report it as a genuine attack. Something felt wrong. The Americans, if launching a first strike, wouldn't send 5 missiles. They'd send hundreds. The new satellite detection system had never been operationally tested. He called it a false alarm. He was right. A satellite had mistaken sunlight reflecting off cloud tops for missile launch plumes. The whole thing was a sensor glitch. In the alternate world where Petrov follows protocol, Soviet command receives a confirmed attack notification. Soviet nuclear doctrine, built around the expectation that warning time is measured in minutes, calls for immediate launch before incoming missiles destroy the capability to respond. Hundreds of Soviet warheads are fired at American cities, military installations, and command infrastructure. American early warning detects the launches. American launch on warning doctrine, also built for this exact scenario, triggers a counter-launch. Both countries empty most of their nuclear arsenals within the hour. The atmospheric and climate modeling for a full US-Soviet nuclear exchange in 1983 suggests a nuclear winter scenario. Enough particulate matter in the upper atmosphere to reduce sunlight reaching the surface for months to years, devastating global agriculture, with famine deaths potentially reaching into the billions across populations that had no role in the conflict. One man had one instinct that felt wrong. That instinct is why there is still a world to have history in. Story 2: Lincoln Lives. What Reconstruction looks like with its architect still standing. Lincoln's approach to Reconstruction was already taking shape before John Wilkes Booth intervened on April 14, 1865, and what it looked like was considerably more conciliatory toward the defeated South than what actually followed. His second inaugural's famous closing, with malice toward none, with charity for all, wasn't just rhetoric. His proposed 10% plan would have readmitted Confederate states once 10% of their 1860 voters swore loyalty oaths, without requiring meaningful structural transformation. This is actually a complicated what-if. Lincoln's generosity toward the South would almost certainly have produced a faster, smoother political reunification. Whether it would have produced a better outcome for formerly enslaved people is genuinely uncertain. What actually happened, the Radical Reconstruction Congress imposing the 14th and 15th Amendments, black male suffrage, federally enforced civil rights, happened partly because Lincoln was gone and the radicals had the political opening. In a Lincoln survived scenario, black men may still have received the vote under political pressure, but the enforcement would have been softer, the military occupation shorter, the transition more negotiated. Without the vindictive years of post-radical Reconstruction backlash, the violent rejection of black political power might also have been less extreme, or Lincoln's conciliation with Southern political leadership might have allowed that leadership to quietly reassert white supremacist control faster and with more legitimacy. What's most likely absent from a Lincoln-survived world is the catastrophic failure of Reconstruction that produced Jim Crow, sharecropping, and a century of organized terror against black Americans. Whether what replaced it would have been genuinely better, or merely a different flavor of inadequate, is the honest uncertainty at the heart of this one. Story 3: The FDR assassination that almost was. What 1933 America looks like without Roosevelt. On February 15, 1933, Giuseppe Zangara fired 5 shots at Franklin Roosevelt in Miami's Bayfront Park. He missed Roosevelt entirely. He hit Chicago Mayor Anton Cermak, who died 19 days later. Roosevelt, unhurt, went on to the presidency he would hold for 12 years, guiding the country through the Great Depression and most of World War II. Roosevelt hadn't yet taken office. He'd been president-elect for 3 months. The country was in the depths of the Depression. Unemployment near 25%, banks failing in waves, the Hoover administration discredited and exhausted. The New Deal, Social Security, the entire architecture of the modern American welfare state, was in the hands of a man who had just almost been killed. Who becomes president if Zangara's aim is better? John Nance Garner, Roosevelt's vice president-elect, a conservative Texas Democrat, would have taken the oath instead. Garner was skeptical of many of the New Deal's most ambitious programs. The aggressive federal intervention Roosevelt brought to the Depression, bank guarantees, agricultural supports, the alphabet agencies, the Works Progress Administration, would have been substantially watered down or absent under Garner. Does the Depression deepen? Almost certainly. Does it eventually end anyway? Probably, but later. Does the U.S. enter World War II? Almost certainly, but the question of when and with what preparation is more open. Roosevelt was a committed internationalist who began preparing America for the conflict well before Pearl Harbor. Garner was not. The Lend-Lease program that kept Britain funded and supplied before U.S. entry might not have existed. A deeper, longer depression. A later, less prepared entry into the war. A different America emerging from both, if it emerged the same way at all. Story 4: Catherine of Aragon has a living son. England stays Catholic, and the world follows. Catherine of Aragon had 6 pregnancies with Henry VIII. One daughter, Mary, survived infancy. If even one of those pregnancies had produced a son who lived to adulthood, Henry has no reason to seek an annulment, no reason to break with Rome, and the English Reformation doesn't happen, at least not driven from the throne. The cascading effects are enormous. The Church of England doesn't exist. The Anglican Communion, that now counts 85 million members worldwide, doesn't exist. The particular brand of Protestant colonialism that shaped the United States, Canada, Australia, South Africa, and India, with its specific theology, its relationship between church and civil authority, its attitudes toward indigenous peoples and slavery, takes an entirely different form, if it happens at all. Ireland's history changes completely. The Irish conflict between Catholic nationalism and Protestant unionism, centuries of blood and political failure rooted directly in the English Reformation and subsequent plantation policies, doesn't have the same shape. Northern Ireland as a place with its specific political meaning may not exist. Scotland's Reformation, which was influenced by but distinct from England's, might still have happened under Calvinist pressure from the continent. But without the English crown's support for Protestant movements abroad, the balance of religious wars in Europe shifts. The 30 Years' War, which killed somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of the German-speaking population, was shaped substantially by the Protestant-Catholic power balance. Different English alignment means different outcomes, different casualty figures, different maps. The colonial Americas, shaped so heavily by whether settlers were Puritan Congregationalists, Catholic Spaniards, or Anglican planters, look entirely different. The cultural and legal inheritance of the English-speaking world, which is to say most of the dominant political and legal culture of the 21st century, has a different foundation. All of it turned on whether one baby boy lived past infancy. Story 5: Carthage wins the Second Punic War. What a Semitic Mediterranean civilization looks like Hannibal Barca crossed the Alps with elephants and an army, descended into Italy, and won battle after battle against Roman forces, Trebia, Lake Trasimene, and most catastrophically Cannae, where roughly 50,000 Roman soldiers died in a single afternoon in what remains one of the most studied tactical encirclements in military history. And then, despite being unbeaten in the field, Hannibal did not sack Rome. He couldn't. He lacked siege equipment and sufficient reinforcements from Carthage, whose political leadership kept those reinforcements from arriving. In the alternate where those reinforcements come, Hannibal takes Rome, or Rome, facing the loss of its Italian allies after Cannae, negotiates a subordinate peace. Either way, Carthage emerges as the dominant Mediterranean power. Carthaginian civilization was Phoenician in origin, Semitic language, Semitic religious traditions, mercantile culture, extensive North African presence, powerful naval capability, and significant influence across the Western Mediterranean, including Spain and trading posts throughout the Atlantic coast. A Carthaginian-dominated Mediterranean would have been a fundamentally different cultural foundation for what came next. Greek thought spreads through different vectors, or doesn't spread the same way at all. Roman law, which underpins virtually every legal tradition in the Western world, doesn't become the template. Latin doesn't become the root of Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Romanian. The Catholic Church, which is Roman in its administrative structure and Latin in its liturgy, has a completely different shape. The question of what the last 2,000 years of human civilization looks like, building on a Carthaginian rather than Roman foundation for the Mediterranean world, is one of the genuinely largest alternate history questions there is. There is no clean answer because the divergence point is so early that almost nothing downstream is predictable. Story 6: Franz Ferdinand's driver takes the right turn. No assassination, maybe no World War I, the most famous wrong turn in history, happened in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, when Archduke Franz Ferdinand's motorcade took an unplanned route that happened to bring him directly past Gavrilo Princip, one of 7 assassins who had already failed earlier that morning when a bomb thrown at the Archduke's car bounced off and exploded under the next vehicle. Princip had given up and was standing at a delicatessen when the car carrying Franz Ferdinand stopped almost in front of him. In the alternate where the driver takes the correct route, Princip doesn't get the second chance. The assassination attempt fails. Franz Ferdinand goes home. Does World War I still happen? This is genuinely contested among historians. The structural pressures that produced the war, the alliance system, the arms race, German anxiety about strategic encirclement, Austro-Hungarian anxiety about South Slavic nationalism, Russian anxiety about strategic access, British concern about European balance, were real and substantial. The assassination was the trigger, but not the underlying explosive. Some historians argue the war was inevitable given these pressures and only needed a different trigger. Others argue that the specific combination of Austria-Hungary's ultimatum to Serbia, Russia's decision to mobilize, and Germany's decision to back Austria-Hungary was not predetermined and required exactly the specific political atmosphere created by the assassination of the Austro-Hungarian heir. If World War I doesn't happen, or happens differently, no Treaty of Versailles, no humiliating German settlement, no fertile ground for the political grievances that produced National Socialism. Adolf Hitler remains a failed art student. The Holocaust doesn't happen. The Soviet Union, which was born from the social collapse of World War I, may not happen. The 20th century most people know may not happen. A driver takes the wrong turn. 50 to 80 million people die. Story 7: The Mongols keep riding west. What happens when they don't stop at Poland by 1241? The Mongol armies under Batu Khan and the general Subutai had done something unprecedented. They had destroyed the Kingdom of Poland at the Battle of Legnica, annihilated a Hungarian army at the Battle of Mohi, and were positioned at the Adriatic coast. With nothing between them and the rest of Western Europe that had yet demonstrated any ability to stop them. Then, Gede Khan died in Mongolia, and Batu turned east to participate in the succession politics. Western Europe was saved by the death of a man it had never heard of. In the alternate, where Gede doesn't die that winter, or where Batu's personal position is secure enough that he keeps moving west, the Mongol army that had destroyed every force it encountered in Eastern Europe advances into France, the Holy Roman Empire, the Italian city-states. These were rich, politically fragmented, militarily disunited powers. The Mongol record against comparable opponents was not encouraging for the defenders. The likelihood of successful conventional military resistance from any individual European power was low. The destruction of Central and Western Europe at the scale the Mongols inflicted on Central Asia, Persia, China, and Eastern Europe, where scholars estimate total deaths in the tens of millions, would have erased the institutional and cultural foundations of what we call Western civilization in its specific form. The Catholic Church, the emerging university system, the feudal legal structures that were beginning to evolve toward constitutional governance, the populations that carried the knowledge and the cultural continuity, all of it in the path of a military machine that was, at this point in history, simply better than anything in its way. What would have been rebuilt from the ruins is completely unknowable, but it would not have been what actually happened. Story 8: Constantine doesn't convert. Christianity stays a fringe religion, and everything changes before Constantine's conversion following the Battle of Milvian Bridge in 312 C. Christianity was one of many mystery religions competing for followers across the Roman Empire, significant in some regions, persecuted intermittently, prohibited from open proselytization, but not remotely the dominant spiritual framework of the Mediterranean world. After the Edict of Milan and Constantine's subsequent support for the Church, Christianity moved from tolerated to privileged to, under Theodosius I, the official state religion of the empire. From there, it shaped everything. In the alternative without Constantine's conversion, Christianity remains a minority religion in a pluralistic polytheistic empire. It may survive, may even eventually find political favor under some other emperor. But without the massive institutional and financial support of Roman imperial patronage, its spread is slower, its institutional development different. It did not become the universal church of the Mediterranean world within a century of Constantine's reign. What fills that space? Mithraism was a major competitor. Neoplatonism had enormous intellectual prestige. Various solar cults were gaining traction in the late Roman religious landscape. One or several of these might have become dominant instead, producing a fundamentally different religious foundation for the post-Roman European world. The specific consequences are vast. There are no crusades. The specific conflict that shaped the relationship between Europe and the Islamic world for centuries, and which still resonates politically today. There is no Christian basis for medieval European law, education, and art. The Protestant Reformation has nothing to reform against. The religious wars of the 16th and 17th centuries don't happen in their specific form. The colonial-era justifications for conquest built on Christian missionary rationale don't exist in the same way. One general's mystical experience at one battle reshaped the spiritual architecture of 2,000 years of history. Story 9: The Library of Alexandria survives. Does history accelerate by 1,000 years? The Library of Alexandria is the greatest intellectual loss in recorded history, or so the popular account holds. The reality is more complicated and more interesting. The library was not destroyed in a single fire, but rather declined over several centuries through a combination of political instability, reduced funding, and partial destruction. Julius Caesar accidentally burned some of it in 48 BCE. Aurelian's attack on Alexandria in 270–271 C damaged the area. The final end came gradually. What's lost is not a single catastrophic moment, but a slow erosion. What was actually in there? Certainly hundreds of thousands of papyrus scrolls, works of Greek philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and literature that we know about only from references in surviving texts. How much of what we don't have now was there? Some portion of it. Probably a significant portion. The most dramatic version of this what if argues that the lost knowledge would have accelerated the scientific revolution by centuries or millennia, that we would have had heliocentrism, calculus, germ theory, and perhaps electricity during the Roman Empire if the texts had survived. This is probably too optimistic. Knowledge isn't just information that needs to be found once. It requires social and economic conditions that support applying it. The manufacturing capacity to turn theoretical insight into useful technology, and institutions that can sustain and transmit technical development across generations. What a surviving library almost certainly gives us: more primary texts of ancient literature, philosophy, and science that we currently know only by reputation, better understanding of ancient mathematics and astronomy, possibly some medical and engineering knowledge that had to be rediscovered. The scientific revolution might come somewhat earlier. The Dark Ages might be somewhat less dark, but the 1,000-year acceleration is probably a fantasy, and the specifics of what was actually lost remain, somewhat ironically, unknown. Story 10: Napoleon goes French Empire in America instead of invading Russia. The U.S. never grows up. Napoleon sold Louisiana to the United States in 1803 for approximately $15 million, 3 cents an acre for 827,000 square miles, because he needed cash for European wars and had concluded that without a strong Caribbean base, a North American empire wasn't viable. Haiti's revolution had just destroyed the economic engine that was supposed to make Louisiana profitable, and the prospect of defending a vast North American territory against British naval power while fighting in Europe was strategically unappealing. In the alternate, where Napoleon consolidates after Amiens rather than resuming European wars, where he decides that the real prize is building French power in the Americas rather than remaking the map of Europe, Louisiana stays French. The United States, already nervous about French control of New Orleans and the Mississippi River, faces a fundamentally different strategic situation: the westward expansion that made the continental United States, the Louisiana Purchase, the subsequent absorption of Texas, the Mexican-American War, eventually the Pacific Coast, simply doesn't happen in the same way. The U.S. remains a relatively modest Atlantic seaboard republic. A French Louisiana, under Napoleon's administrative genius, would have been a genuinely powerful entity. French settlers, potentially freed Haitian veterans and refugees, indigenous alliances, control of the Mississippi. The agricultural and commercial potential was enormous. It would have blocked American continental expansion, potentially permanently. What grows up in North America under this scenario? A more modest United States, a French Louisiana, Spanish holdings in the Southwest and West, British Canada. The continent doesn't unify under American hegemony. The 20th century superpower that determines global history doesn't exist. What does exist instead is anyone's guess. Story 11: The Aztecs hold Tenochtitlan. A surviving Mesoamerican civilization reshapes the Americas. The fall of Tenochtitlan in August 1521 was not inevitable from the moment Herncourts landed. The Aztec capital was one of the largest cities in the world, larger than any city in contemporary Europe, built on a lake island, defensively formidable, and populated by people who had demonstrated in the Noche Triste that they could defeat and nearly destroy a Spanish force. What ultimately did it was the combination of smallpox devastating the Aztec population, the alliance of tens of thousands of indigenous fighters from peoples subjugated by the Aztecs, and the naval advantage Cortes' brigantines provided on the lake. Remove the smallpox, or give the Aztecs enough time for the biological impact to pass before the final siege, and the calculus shifts significantly. Cortes' force, without indigenous allies, was not capable of taking Tenochtitlan. The alliance of tributary peoples who defected to the Spanish did so partly because they hated Aztec domination, an Aztec leadership that recognized this threat to its imperial system and found ways to conciliate its tributary peoples might have held the alliance together and held the city. A surviving Aztec empire in 1521 doesn't survive contact with European disease forever. That wave was going to wash over the Americas regardless, but it might have survived long enough and in sufficient political coherence to negotiate different terms of contact rather than experiencing annihilation. A weakened but continuing Aztec political structure could have brokered relationships with European powers, more like Japan's controlled engagement with Portugal, allowing limited trade while maintaining sovereignty. Mesoamerican civilization, its cities, its agriculture, its astronomy, its artistic traditions, contributing continuously to world history rather than being destroyed within a generation, is a fundamentally different version of the Americas. Story 12. What if this is a simulation? The question that can't be answered from inside this is technically not a historical what if in the same sense as the others, but it belongs in any list of genuinely destabilizing speculative questions, because it doesn't merely ask what would be different, it asks whether any of what we call history is what it presents itself as being. Nick Bostrom's simulation argument, taken seriously by a surprising number of physicists and philosophers, runs something like this: if it's possible to create a conscious experience simulation, and if the number of simulated histories eventually exceeds the number of lived histories by a large margin, then any randomly selected conscious experience is more likely to be simulated than original. The number of possible simulated minds in a mature, universe-spanning civilization could vastly exceed the number of biological minds that produced it. The practical challenge is that the argument is unfalsifiable from inside. Any evidence we might gather about the nature of reality, including the suspiciously mathematical structure of physics, the way observation seems to affect quantum states, the specific fine-tuning of physical constants, is equally consistent with a genuine universe and with a simulated one. There is no experiment that outputs definitely real rather than consistent with simulation. What changes if it's true? Every historical question reframes. Was the Battle of Thermopylae a real event that shaped civilization, or a scripted node in a narrative? Did Stanislav Petrov's judgment save the world, or was the scenario constructed to produce that outcome? The branching structure of alternate history becomes literally a question about whether those branches exist as running simulations somewhere. Most usefully for the list it appears on, every what-if question in this collection becomes a question about which branch, if any, was actually run. Story 13. Japan doesn't bomb Pearl Harbor. America stays out of the war. Germany wins American isolationism before December 7, 1941, was not simply a political position. It was the dominant public sentiment in a country that had sent its young men to die in European trenches 20 years earlier and received nothing they could see for it. Roosevelt was running weapons to Britain through Lend-Lease and slowly strangling Japan with oil sanctions. But getting America into the war as a fighting force required the political opening that Pearl Harbor provided. Without the attack, that opening probably doesn't materialize. In the alternate where Japan pursues its Pacific expansion without touching American territory or forces, the war against China continues. Potentially, Southeast Asian targets are hit, but the United States stays on the sidelines. Congress does not declare war. The American industrial mobilization, which ultimately produced the arsenal that supplied Britain, the Soviet Union, and the Allied invasion of Europe, happens much more slowly, if at all. Britain, already struggling, continues fighting but cannot alone generate the forces to contest a German-dominated continent. The Soviet Union is bleeding catastrophically in its war with Germany. Without American material support on anything like the historical scale, the Eastern Front's outcome becomes considerably less certain. Stalingrad might still happen. The Soviets had strategic depth and extraordinary willingness to absorb casualties. But the projection of Soviet power westward from a position of victory is much harder without the American equipment, food, and supplies that flowed under Lend-Lease. The most likely world without Pearl Harbor, a negotiated European settlement with Germany controlling most of the continent, a Soviet Union that survives but is too exhausted and isolated to project power, and a United States that emerges from the war without having fought it. Economically powerful but strategically peripheral, watching a divided Europe from across an ocean. Story 14. Non-avian dinosaurs survive. What 66 million years of continued dinosaur evolution looks like the Chicxulub impactor, roughly 12 kilometers across, struck what is now the UK-10 Peninsula 66 million years ago and wiped out approximately 75% of all species on Earth, including every non-avian dinosaur. The mammals that survived were mostly small, nocturnal, insectivorous creatures that could live in burrows and survive the darkness and cold of the impact winter. With the dinosaurs gone, Those mammals had 66 million years of empty ecological niches to fill. They became us, among other things. In the alternate, without the impact, dinosaurs continue evolving for 66 million years. The question isn't whether the dinosaurs of the Cretaceous stick around in their current form. Evolution doesn't work that way. But what 66 million additional years of dinosaur evolution produces. Dinosaurs had already demonstrated extraordinary adaptive range, warm-blooded theropods with complex social behaviors, giant sauropods, flying pterosaurs, armored ankylosaurs. This is a lineage that produces feathers, possibly produces complex communication, possibly produces social structures of surprising sophistication. The larger mammals that would need 66 million years of unopposed evolution to produce primates, and then humans don't get that opportunity. Something else fills that space. The probability that something else produces technology using sapient intelligence on anything like the same timeline is genuinely low. The specific path from small nocturnal mammal to Homo sapiens required the extinction event to open the space. Earth 2025 in this alternate universe is probably a world of diverse, possibly intelligent, non-avian dinosaurs, complex ecosystems structured around dinosaur apex predators, and no humans. Whatever sapient life emerged, if any, would be something we can barely imagine from the inside of the evolutionary path we actually took. Story 15: the U.S. honored its treaties with native nations. A continent with a different map, the United States government negotiated and signed approximately 375 treaties with indigenous nations between 1778 and 1871, and violated the binding terms of essentially all of them. The violations were not incidental or occasional. They were systematic, often legally justified through retroactive reinterpretation, congressional unilateral action, or simply military force applied to peoples the government had just promised to protect. The result was the dispossession of indigenous peoples from virtually all of the land they had been promised, often multiple times. In the alternate, where the federal government enforces treaty commitments as binding constitutional obligations, which is technically what they are, since treaties are supreme law under the Constitution, the map of North America looks fundamentally different. The Great Sioux Reservation, as defined by the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty, would have included the Black Hills, precluding the gold rush that shattered the treaty 7 years after it was signed. Cherokee sovereignty in the southeast, guaranteed and then stripped in the Trail of Tears, would have produced a Cherokee political entity that survived into the modern era. The continental United States, if treaty obligations had been honored, might look something like a patchwork of indigenous sovereign nations alongside U.S. states, a genuinely pluralistic political geography rather than the absorbed, dispossessed, reservation-fragmented situation that actually resulted. The economic development of the West, which was built on lands taken from indigenous peoples, would have proceeded differently, or not at all, in specific regions. The cultural and demographic composition of the American West would be unrecognizably different. The total human cost of the actual history, wars, forced relocations, starvation, cultural destruction, demographic collapse from roughly 5 million people to fewer than 250,000 at the nadir, represents one of the largest preventable catastrophes in American history, sustained by political choices made again and again over a century. Story 16: every person gets one decision to undo. The day the world replays itself, this one departs from historical what-if into speculative philosophy. And it's worth engaging with seriously, because what it's actually exploring is something profound about regret, causality, and the nature of choice. The prompt imagines a single moment, perhaps a morning everyone wakes up with this power, and asks what happens to history, society, and human relationships when every person can erase one decision from their personal timeline. The immediate chaos would be extraordinary. Personal histories are interconnected. The decision you undo affects not just you, but everyone whose lives intersected with the decision you made. Undo a marriage, and you potentially unmake children who currently exist. Undo a job offer accepted, and you ripple through the career trajectories of everyone who was hired or not hired as a result. Undo a moment of violence, and the victim's life reconstructs in ways that affect everyone around them. At scale, the second-order effects would be genuinely incomprehensible. If millions of people undo major life decisions simultaneously, the resulting rewritten timeline would contain millions of simultaneous contradictions. People who are married to different people, people who never moved to the cities where they currently live, businesses that don't exist because a key founder took a different path. The resulting timeline would need to reconcile all of these changes simultaneously, which produces something closer to a total reconstruction of the present than a set of discrete personal corrections. What this what if is really asking is, do humans know what they actually want? The research on predicted versus experienced utility, what we think will make us happy versus what actually does, suggests our regrets are often directed at the wrong decisions. People typically regret inaction more than action over the long run, which means the collective exercise of this hypothetical power would probably be less useful than everyone imagines on the morning it arrives. Story 17: Rome goes east, Alexander goes west. Two empires that never should have collided. This is a speculative alternate history question built on a compression of centuries, but the underlying premise is genuinely interesting. What if the two greatest military and political expansion projects of the ancient Mediterranean world had been oriented in opposite directions, giving each room to develop without conflict? Alexander the Great's actual trajectory was eastward, into Persia, Central Asia, Afghanistan, and India. His empire, which died with him at 32, was immediately fragmented among his successors. Rome's actual expansion was westward first, and then northward and eastward as the Republic and then Empire accumulated power over centuries. In the hypothetical where Alexander's Macedon expands westward into Carthaginian territory, the Italian peninsula and potentially Iberia, Rome, if it exists in anything like its historical form, faces a Macedonian empire at its borders from a very early stage. The Roman Republic that defeated Carthage and eventually conquered Greece did so as a mature Mediterranean power. A young Roman city-state facing Macedonian phalanxes under Alexander himself would not have had similar success. Rome going east while Alexander goes west means neither of them achieves the specific historical outcomes that shaped the ancient world. Hellenistic culture spreading into Central Asia and India doesn't happen the same way, and Roman law and governance spreading across Europe and North Africa doesn't happen the same way. What you get instead is something new: a Macedonian-influenced Western Mediterranean and a Rome-influenced Eastern Mediterranean, or, more likely, simply a different set of empires and cultural foundations than the ones that produce the world we know. Story 18: The Mongol Empire freezes at peak. The largest land empire that decided to settle down at its peak in the 13th century, the Mongol Empire was the largest contiguous land empire in history, stretching from Korea to Eastern Europe, from Siberia to Persia. It was also one of the most destructive forces in human history. The campaigns that built it killed somewhere between 30 and 40 million people by various estimates, depopulating entire regions, destroying cities that took centuries to recover, and permanently altering the demographic and cultural composition of Central Asia and the Middle East. In the alternate, where the empire stops expanding but doesn't collapse, where instead of the fragmentation into competing successor states, a stable administrative confederation holds together the conquered territory, the Pax Mongolica, the actual historical period of relative stability in Mongol-controlled regions that allowed the Silk Road trade to function with unprecedented efficiency, becomes permanent, rather than a brief interlude before fragmentation. The connected trade routes from China to Eastern Europe, administered by a single overarching political authority, would have accelerated economic and cultural exchange at a scale that didn't actually occur until the modern era. European access to Chinese technology, gunpowder, printing, advanced metallurgy, comes centuries earlier than it actually did. The Black Death, which historically spread along Mongol trade routes, also moves faster in this more connected world, potentially hitting harder everywhere simultaneously. The specific fragmentation of successor states that eventually allowed the Ottoman Empire to rise, and through Ottoman territorial expansion, eventually reshaped the Islamic world and the Eastern Mediterranean. Doesn't happen. The entire subsequent political geography of Eurasia reorganizes around a fundamentally different power structure. Story 19 Europeans arrive in North America and find another European presence already there. This is actually not entirely hypothetical. Norse settlement at Lalonde Oaks Meadows in Newfoundland around 1000 C is archaeologically confirmed, and recent genetic evidence suggests limited Polynesian contact with South America pre-Columbus. But the question here seems to be about what happens politically and legally if definitive evidence emerged that a European group had established settlement in North America before or alongside indigenous peoples, and what claims this would create. The honest historical answer is that indigenous presence in North America predates any confirmed European arrival by at least 15 to 20,000 years, based on archaeological and genetic evidence that is genuinely overwhelming. There is no serious archaeological, genetic, or historical debate about this among researchers who work on it. The political question being gestured at: what if evidence emerged that claimed to undermine indigenous land claims by establishing a prior or simultaneous European presence? Reflects a misunderstanding of how those claims work. Land rights in most legal frameworks derive from use, occupation, treaty, and political sovereignty, not from being first in an absolute archaeological sense that ignores 15,000 years of continuous habitation. What this what if is actually about is political rather than historical. The desire to find a factual argument that resolves ongoing disputes about indigenous sovereignty and land claims in a specific direction. The historical evidence doesn't cooperate with that desire, which is itself a data point worth noting when thinking about why this particular speculative premise recurs in some political contexts. Story 20 Alexander lives to 65. Does he consolidate, expand, or tear it all apart? Alexander the Great died in Babylon in June 323 BC at the age of 32. The cause remains disputed. Typhoid fever complicated by excessive drinking, poisoning, and other theories have all been proposed. He died without having named a successor for an empire stretching from Greece to the Indus River, which is why the entire thing immediately collapsed into the wars of the Diadochi as his generals fought each other for pieces of what he'd built. Giving Alexander another 33 years to 65 a plausible life expectancy for a man of his wealth and access to medical care, if he survived, transforms the question entirely. At 32, he had just turned back from India because his exhausted army refused to march further. He was planning campaigns against Arabia and potentially into Western Europe. A 65-year-old Alexander has had 3 decades to consolidate, administer, and potentially expand further. The most significant change from a living Alexander is the succession question. By 65, he has an adult heir, either Roxana's son Alexander IV or someone from a new marriage, who can hold the empire together rather than having it immediately fragmented. The Hellenistic world, that historically was 4 competing successor states, became potentially a unified Macedonian empire. What a unified Hellenistic empire looks like a century after a 65-year-old Alexander's death is where the genuine speculation begins. Greek administrative practices absorbed into Persian governing traditions, applied across a territory from the Aegean to the Indus, could have produced something genuinely extraordinary. Or it could have eventually fragmented anyway, because empires of that size required communication and transportation technologies that didn't exist yet. Rome, in this scenario, is still growing. The collision between a surviving Hellenistic empire and an expanding Rome is one of history's great missed spectacles. Story 21 Steve Jobs never returns to Apple. We get a different technology world. Steve Jobs was pushed out of Apple in 1985 after a power struggle with the board and CEO John Sculley, founded NXT Computer, and spent 12 years building a company that was critically acclaimed but never commercially successful. When Apple bought NXT in 1997, it got jobs back, and within 3 years, he had saved a company that was weeks from bankruptcy and set it on the path to becoming the most valuable corporation in history. In the alternate, where Jobs stays at NXT or pursues other things and never returns, Apple's trajectory in the late 1990s and 2000s is much darker. The company was genuinely close to failure before his return. The products that defined an era, the iMac, iPod, iPhone, iPad, the App Store, iTunes, either don't exist or exist in substantially different forms, developed by different people under different design philosophies. The iPhone specifically deserves attention here because it didn't just create Apple's current dominance, it fundamentally reshaped entire industries. Social media, as currently practiced, is an iPhone-era phenomenon. The attention economy, built on the always-in-pocket supercomputer that the iPhone was the first to make mainstream, is shaped directly by the specific design choices Jobs made about how that device should work. The app ecosystem, the touchscreen interface paradigm, the specific way billions of people interact with technology daily. All of this is Jobs contingent. A world without Jobs' return to Apple doesn't mean no smartphones. Multiple technology trajectories were converging on something like a smartphone in the early 2000s. But the specific form, the specific design choices that shaped a billion people's relationship with technology would have been different. Less likely to be elegant, possibly less addictive, probably less beautiful. Story 22: Rome pacifies Germania. Latin becomes the language of the Rhine, and beyond the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest in 9 Say is one of the most consequential military defeats in history, though it's far less famous than comparable turning points. 3 Roman legions, roughly 20,000 soldiers, were led into an ambush by Arminius, a Germanic chieftain who had served in the Roman army and knew its tactics intimately. The legions were destroyed over 3 days in the forest, and their commander Publius Quinctilius Varus died by suicide. The Roman strategy of annexing and Romanizing Germania east of the Rhine essentially ended that morning. The Rhine became the permanent northeastern frontier of the Roman Empire. The Germanic peoples beyond it, the Franks, the Saxons, the Goths, the Vandals, the Lombards, were never incorporated into the Roman cultural and administrative system. They remained Germanic-speaking. When the Western Empire eventually fell in the 5th century, it fell to people who had never been part of it. In the alternate, where the legions win and Roman pacification of Germania proceeds over the following century, the cultural Romanization that happened so comprehensively in Gaul, Iberia, and North Africa happens in Germania too. The Germanic peoples learn Latin, adopt Roman law, and participate in Roman civic life. Their languages, rather than forming the Germanic branch of the European language family, gradually yielded to Latin the way Celtic languages yielded to Latin in France and Spain. The consequence of this is that the Germanic invasions that ended the Western Empire either don't happen from the same peoples or happen differently. France, Germany, and England would all speak Romance languages. English, which is half Germanic in its vocabulary and grammar, would not exist in anything like its current form. The cultural foundations of Northern and Western Europe, and through them, North America and Australia, would be fundamentally different. Story 23: The Chicxulub asteroid misses. 66 million years more of dinosaur evolution. The asteroid that ended the Cretaceous period was 12 kilometers across, struck at roughly 20 kilometers per second, and released energy equivalent to roughly 1 billion nuclear weapons in a single instant. The immediate destruction was vast. The longer-term effect, a global winter from ejecta blocking sunlight, followed by a hothouse period from released CO2, followed by the collapse of food chains worldwide, killed approximately 75% of all species on Earth, including every non-avian dinosaur. The small mammals that survived were not the dominant life forms of the Cretaceous. They were marginal, small, nocturnal creatures living in the shadow of a world dominated by dinosaurs. The extinction gave them 66 million years to fill every ecological niche the dinosaurs had vacated. They became whales, bats, horses, elephants, great apes, and eventually us. Without the impact, those 66 million years belong to continued dinosaur evolution. The theropod lineage, the one that actually did produce birds, was already showing signs of behavioral and cognitive complexity that some paleontologists find genuinely impressive. Whether that lineage, given 66 million more years, could have produced sapient intelligence is genuinely unknown. The evolutionary pressures that drove primate intelligence, social complexity, tool use, specific environmental challenges, might or might not apply to a theropod lineage. The most likely outcome isn't sapient dinosaurs. It's a world of extraordinarily diverse, continued dinosaur life, with ecosystems we can barely imagine from our mammal-shaped perspective. Humans don't exist. Whatever fills our ecological niche, or whether anything does, is a matter of pure speculation. The planet is still there. It's just running a completely different experiment. Story 24: Napoleon cancels the Russian invasion. The Grande Arme survives, and Europe bends. The Russian campaign of 1812 destroyed Napoleon's empire as surely as any military defeat. He marched 600,000 soldiers into Russia and brought fewer than 100,000 back in fighting condition. The political consequences were immediate. Prussia switched sides. The coalition that had been holding together through French military intimidation collapsed into active resistance, and within 2 years Napoleon was in exile on Elba. The Russian catastrophe didn't just lose a campaign, it broke the mystique of invincibility that had kept hostile powers in check and frightened neutrals into accommodation. In the alternate, where Napoleon recognizes the Russian campaign as strategically unnecessary, Russia wasn't threatening France. The conflict arose from Russian defection from the continental system trade blockade, and holds the Grande Arme at its peak. The continental system itself was genuinely unenforceable without Russian participation. So Napoleon faces a strategic problem with no good solution. But a French empire at its 1812 territorial extent, with 600,000 soldiers still alive and the military reputation intact, is a fundamentally different proposition than the exhausted, overextended empire that eventually fell. Britain remains the undefeatable adversary. Naval power and industrial capacity keep it beyond French reach, but a stable French-dominated European continental system, with Prussia and Austria kept in subordination by a functional Grande Arme, is plausibly sustainable for decades. The German unification under Prussian leadership that produced modern Germany doesn't happen on its historical timeline. The specific political geography of 19th century Europe, the nation-states that emerged from the Napoleonic collapse and the nationalist movements it inspired, reorganizes around a different balance of power. Not a French world forever, but a significantly different 19th century. Story 25: Guns were never invented. Does Europe still dominate, or does everything change? Gunpowder was invented in China, refined over centuries, and eventually weaponized into guns that spread through Islamic armies and into European hands around the 14th century. The question of what history looks like without guns requires unpacking what gunpowder weapons actually changed, and which of those changes were gunpowder specific versus changes that would have happened anyway through some other mechanism. The most immediate military consequence of firearms was the obsolescence of medieval plate armor and fortifications. A knight in full harness could be killed by a common soldier with minimal training, which fundamentally disrupted the feudal military order and eventually the feudal social order that rested on it. Without firearms, the feudal military structure, based on heavily armored cavalry and specialist archers, may have persisted considerably longer. Whether European feudalism eventually dissolved through economic and political pressure without the military revolution is uncertain but plausible. The colonial project is the more significant question. European conquest of the Americas was enabled by a combination of disease, firearms, and steel armor. The disease was the dominant factor, but the military technology allowed very small forces to punch catastrophically above their weight. Without guns, Spanish conquistadors of several hundred men cannot defeat Aztec and Inca armies of tens of thousands. The arithmetic simply doesn't work. Conquest of indigenous American populations would have required genuinely large European armies, which were not available and couldn't have been sustained in the logistics environment of the 16th century. Colonialism likely still happens, but much more slowly, much more negotiated, and with dramatically different outcomes for indigenous populations. A world without guns is probably a more balanced world, at least for the first several centuries. Whether it eventually finds other technologies of equally decisive asymmetric advantage is the genuine uncertainty. Story 26, what if we chose unity over division? The philosophical what if that resists easy answers this one is deliberately framed as a values question rather than a historical one, and it's worth engaging with carefully because it touches on a genuine tension in how diversity and unity function in complex societies. The framing of unity instead of diversity as a historical what if obscures that diversity is not primarily a choice or a policy, but a description of existing conditions. Human populations are diverse in language, culture, religion, values, and biological variation, and have been for the entirety of recorded history. The political question is always about how diverse societies are organized and governed, not whether diversity exists. Historical experiments in imposed unity, forced assimilation, elimination of cultural and religious difference through state power, suppression of minority languages and practices have a consistent record. They generate resentment, resistance, and eventually violent conflict. The Ottoman millet system, which managed ethnic and religious diversity through formal recognition rather than suppression, produced centuries of relative stability in a region that has generated continuous conflict under more exclusionary frameworks. The specific form of civic nationalism that developed in liberal democracies, unity around shared political values and institutions rather than shared ethnicity or culture, has proven more stable than ethnic nationalist frameworks demanding cultural homogeneity. The genuine insight behind this what if is the wish for less conflict, less tribalism, more cooperation on problems that require collective action. Those are legitimate aspirations, but the historical evidence that diversity is the cause of those problems, rather than the political frameworks for managing difference, points in a different direction than the premise of the question. The problem has rarely been diversity. It has been the specific ways political and economic power has been organized around difference. Story 27, Neanderthals become the dominant hominid. A different kind of person builds the world. Neanderthals coexisted with Homo sapiens for a period of thousands of years before disappearing from the fossil record approximately 40,000 years ago. They were not the brutish, dim-witted creatures depicted in early 20th century art. They buried their dead, used ochre pigment, made jewelry, cared for injured community members who couldn't survive alone, and interbred with modern humans enough that most non-African people today carry roughly 1–2% Neanderthal DNA. They were people, different people, but people. What Neanderthals didn't do, as far as the archaeological record shows, was produce symbolic art at the scale and variety that Homo sapiens did approximately 40,000 to 50,000 years ago. The cave paintings, the carved figurines, the proliferation of representational and abstract imagery that marks what scholars call the Upper Paleolithic Revolution. This explosion of symbolic thinking seems to be associated with behavioral modernity, the full cognitive package that eventually produced agriculture, cities, writing, and science. Whether Neanderthals had the cognitive architecture to eventually reach that same threshold is genuinely unknown. Their brain volume was comparable to ours, structured somewhat differently, and the specific genetic variants associated with language production that appear in Homo sapiens do also appear in Neanderthal DNA. The case for Neanderthal cognitive capacity is stronger than it was 20 years ago. In the alternate where Neanderthals outcompete or outlast Homo sapiens, does behavioral modernity emerge eventually in a Neanderthal population? Does it emerge differently, producing technology and culture built on a different cognitive foundation? The world that would have been built by a different kind of intelligent hominid is genuinely alien to imagine. Not necessarily worse, not better, but different in ways that go all the way down to the structure of thought itself. Story 28 Eve doesn't eat the apple. Humanity lives in perfect obedience and never grows up. This what if operates in the register of theological mythology rather than historical counterfactual, and it's worth engaging with on its own terms, because the story of the fall is one of the most psychologically rich narratives in the Western tradition, and its implications are considerably more ambiguous than the word forbidden implies. The Genesis narrative describes a garden in which humans lived without knowledge of good and evil, without the awareness of mortality, without the self-consciousness that produces both shame and creativity. The serpent's offer, "You will be like gods, knowing good and evil," is taken by the text as transgression. But what is actually being offered is something that defines human experience as we have it: moral agency, self-awareness, the capacity for genuine choice between right and wrong rather than pure obedience, and the consciousness of death that makes finite existence feel meaningful. C.S. Lewis and other theologians have noted the peculiarity of a prohibition on knowledge of good and evil. In what sense can beings who don't know good from evil be morally responsible for their choices? John Milton's Paradise Lost treats the fall with enough complexity that Satan's position has seemed to some readers more coherent than it should, and Eve's curiosity more understandable than the narrative strictly intends. In the alternate where Eve obeys, humanity remains in a state of perpetual childhood, innocent, obedient, without the self-consciousness that drives art, science, philosophy, ethics, and everything else we call civilization. The world the Abrahamic tradition describes as the object of divine love, a humanity capable of genuine relationship with God, because capable of genuine choice, doesn't exist. What remains is a pleasant garden populated by beings who have never had to decide anything. Whether this is paradise or a more comfortable kind of emptiness is the question the story keeps asking. Story 29 Truman orders the invasion of Japan, Operation Downfall, and the bloodiest campaign of the war, the decision to drop atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, was made partly on the basis of estimates for Operation Downfall, the planned Allied invasion of the Japanese home islands, which military planners projected would cost between 250,000 and 1 million American casualties, and potentially many times that number in Japanese military and civilian deaths. The invasion never happened. The bombs fell, Japan surrendered, and the invasion was canceled. In the alternate without the atomic bomb option, or where Truman decides not to use it, Operation Downfall proceeds in 2 phases. Operation Olympic, the invasion of Kyushu planned for November 1945, would have met a Japanese defense that was already largely anticipated and prepared for. Ultra Signals intelligence had revealed the Japanese had concentrated massive forces on Kyushu, specifically because their own planners had predicted the invasion point. The landings would have succeeded eventually, but at catastrophic cost on both sides. Operation Coronet, the subsequent invasion of Honshu near Tokyo planned for March 1946, would have been the decisive phase, and by this point, Japan's civilian population would have been mobilized for suicidal resistance in ways that planners genuinely feared. The Japanese military's plans, captured after the war, included arming civilians with bamboo spears. The realistic casualty estimates for Operation Coronet and serious historical analyses range into the millions on both sides. The Japan that emerges from this process, occupied after a ground campaign that literally fought over every town and city, would have been demographically and structurally devastated in ways that the actual post-war reconstruction couldn't have replicated. The specific Japanese economic miracle of the 1950s and 60s doesn't happen on the same timeline. The model of rapid post-war reconstruction under American occupation that became the template for West Germany and Japan doesn't quite exist. Story 30 No money, no concept of value. Can human society exist without exchange? This is one of the most fundamental what-ifs on the list, because it asks not about a decision or an event, but about a foundational feature of human social organization that appears to be close to universal across all known complex societies. Every large-scale human civilization has developed some form of value exchange, barter, commodity money, currency, credit, because the alternative, pure gift economy or pure communal production appears to reach practical limits at relatively small group sizes. The argument for the universality of some form of value accounting comes from both anthropological observation and game theory. In small, closely related bands where everyone knows everyone and reputation is continuous, gift economy and reciprocal exchange without formal accounting can function. These are documented. As group size increases, the cognitive and social mechanisms that sustain gift economy become insufficient to coordinate complex production and distribution. Something like money, a generalized medium of exchange, becomes functionally necessary to allow specialization at the scale that makes cities and complex technology possible. In the alternative, without any concept of value or exchange, human society either stays at the band level, small, nomadic, subsistence, or it develops alternative coordination mechanisms whose form is genuinely hard to predict. Centralized command economies, where a planning authority allocates resources without price signals, have been tried at scale in the 20th century with results that suggest the information problem of allocating complex resources without price signals is genuinely difficult. This isn't an argument for any specific economic system. It's an observation that the function money serves appears to require some kind of mechanism to perform it, and the mechanisms that have been tried without money have their own serious problems. Story 31, The Plague of Justinian Never Happens. Does Byzantium reunite the Mediterranean? The Plague of Justinian, arriving in Constantinople in 541 C and recurring in waves for the next 2 centuries, was one of the first documented appearances of bubonic plague in Europe. It killed roughly 25 to 50 million people, potentially half the population of the Byzantine Empire, and a significant portion of the Sassanid Persian Empire simultaneously. The timing was devastating in its specificity. Emperor Justinian I had just spent decades, enormous treasure, and most of the empire's military capability reconquering North Africa, Italy, and parts of Spain, coming closer than any post-Roman ruler to reassembling the Western Empire. The plague destroyed the demographic and economic base that could have sustained and consolidated those conquests. The reconquered territories, weakly held, fragmented, and were lost over the following century. The empire that survived was a shadow of what Justinian had built, unable to resist the Arab-Muslim expansion that arrived a century later. Without the plague, Justinian's Italy is more securely held and Romanized over the following generations. The Lombard invasion of 568, which established the lasting fragmentation of Italy into multiple political units that persisted into the 19th century, may not succeed against a stronger Byzantine defensive posture. A stable Byzantine Italy means a different medieval Catholic Church, because the specific administrative independence of the papacy developed precisely in the political vacuum left by weak or absent Byzantine control. The Arab-Muslim expansion of the 7th century still happens. The religious and political forces driving it were internal to the Arabian Peninsula and wouldn't have been prevented by a stronger Byzantium. But a healthier, more populous, more financially robust Byzantine Empire would have resisted it much more effectively than the exhausted, plague-reduced empire that actually confronted it. The boundary between Christian and Islamic political control in the Mediterranean might have stabilized much further east and south than it actually did. Story 32, The Black Death kills 10% instead of 50%. Europe doesn't get its radical reset. The Black Death, arriving in Europe in 1347, killed somewhere between 30% and 60% of the European population over the following 5 years. The estimates vary by region and methodology, but the scale is not seriously contested. The demographic catastrophe reshaped the social, economic, and religious foundations of European civilization in ways that made the subsequent centuries possible in their specific form. The labor scarcity that followed the plague was a direct driver of the end of serfdom in Western Europe. When half the workers are dead, surviving agricultural laborers can demand wages and freedom rather than accepting bondage. The economic disruption challenged the Church's authority in ways that contributed to the conditions for the Protestant Reformation a century and a half later. The psychological impact, the ubiquitous presence of death, the failure of religious observance to prevent the catastrophe, the direct confrontation with mortality, is documented in the art, literature, and theology of the period in ways that shaped European intellectual life profoundly. In the alternate, where the plague is significantly less deadly, killing 10% rather than 50%, European serfdom has less pressure to end on its historical timeline. The Church's authority is challenged less dramatically. The specific intellectual and spiritual crisis that produced first mysticism and then Reformation doesn't have the same fuel. The economic conditions that drove the Italian Renaissance, wealthy merchant classes in politically fragmented city-states, created partly by the demographic reset, are weaker. The Renaissance, Reformation, and the specific European intellectual tradition that produced the scientific revolution are all contingent on a catastrophe that killed tens of millions of people. Less catastrophe means a different civilization. Story 33: Persia breaks through at Thermopylae. Does Greek civilization survive? The Battle of Thermopylae in 480 B was not itself decisive. Leonidas and the 300 Spartans, alongside several thousand other Greek allies, were eventually killed, and the Persian army under Xerxes did advance into Greece, sacking and burning Athens. But the 3-day delay at Thermopylae allowed the Greek fleet to position at Salamis, where the Persian navy was destroyed, and the land campaign ultimately failed at Plataea. The combined naval and land victories stopped the Persian conquest. The specific what-if here, Persia breaks through Thermopylae, is somewhat misframed because Persia did break through eventually by finding a path around the pass through the mountains. The question might better be stated as, what if Thermopylae falls faster, giving the Greeks less time to prepare the Salamis naval position, and the broader campaign goes differently? A Persian victory over the Greek city-states in 480-479 would mean bringing Greek civilization under a Achaemenid administration. The Persian model was actually fairly tolerant of local culture, as demonstrated by their treatment of conquered peoples in other regions. Greek philosophy, art, and political thought might have continued under Persian overlordship rather than being extinguished. But Athenian democracy specifically was the direct product of a politically independent Athens. Under Persian administration, the specific experiment in self-governance that produced democracy, trial by jury, and the intellectual freedom that enabled Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle is either constrained or eliminated. Greek thought that shaped Western civilization, not just political philosophy, but mathematics, medicine, theater, and the fundamental frameworks of rational inquiry, develops differently under conditions of political subordination than it did under Athenian independence. Story 34: The Soviet Union never collapses. The Cold War goes cold indefinitely. The Soviet Union dissolved on December 25, 1991. An outcome that had been assessed as possible, but not inevitable even by informed analysts a decade earlier. It dissolved under the specific combination of Gorbachev's reform program, glasnost, and perestroika, economic stagnation that made the system's fundamental inefficiencies impossible to sustain, nationalist pressures in the republics, and the political dynamics of a leadership that ultimately didn't deploy the military force that might have held it together. In the alternate, where the Soviet Union either doesn't reform or reforms without collapsing, where harder-line leadership succeeds Brezhnev and maintains the system through repression, or where reform succeeds in producing a functioning Soviet-style social democracy rather than dissolution. The United States doesn't experience the brief period of unchallenged global dominance that shaped the 1990s. NATO doesn't expand eastward into former Warsaw Pact territory, the expansion that has been cited by some analysts as a major contributing factor to the deterioration of US-Russian relations that produced the current conflict in Ukraine. Russia doesn't experience the chaotic 1990s privatization that produced the oligarch class and eventually Vladimir Putin's authoritarian capitalism, because Russia stays the Soviet Union and the privatization doesn't happen. The specific geopolitical configuration of 2025, a declining American hegemony, a resurgent Russian military power, a rapidly rising China, is substantially different if the Soviet Union remains intact as a functioning counterweight throughout this period. Whether a continued Soviet Union is preferable to what actually happened depends enormously on where you lived and what you value. But the specific conflicts and instabilities of the post-Cold War world are, in significant part, products of how the Cold War ended rather than that it ended. Story 35: Justinian reconquers the West and holds it. One Rome again. For a while longer, Justinian I, ruling from Constantinople from 527 to 565 C, came closer than any Byzantine emperor before or after to reassembling something resembling the old Roman Empire. His general Belisarius reconquered North Africa from the Vandals, most of Italy from the Ostrogoths, and parts of Spain from the Visigoths. For a brief moment, most of the Mediterranean coastline was again under Roman administration. Then the plague arrived. The treasury collapsed. The army exhausted itself in the Italian campaign that dragged on for decades, and the whole project began slowly coming apart before Justinian was dead. In the alternate where Justinian's reconquest holds, where the plague is less severe, where the Italian campaign concludes faster and more decisively, where the Sassanid Persian frontier remains stable enough not to drain the empire's resources simultaneously, a reunited Mediterranean under Byzantine Roman administration in the late 6th century changes everything about what the early medieval period looks like. The Western European successor kingdoms, the Franks, the Visigoths, the Anglo-Saxons, exist in a different political context when there's a functioning Roman imperial authority to their south that claims at least nominal supremacy. The most significant change involves Islam and its expansion. The Arab-Muslim conquests of the 7th century succeeded largely because they were hitting an exhausted Byzantine Empire and a Sassanid Persian Empire that had been fighting each other to mutual ruination. A Byzantine Empire that had consolidated the West rather than spending itself on that project might have had the resources to resist the Arab expansion much more effectively, changing the boundary between the Islamic and Christian worlds in ways that reshaped the entire medieval and modern political geography of 3 continents.